At sunrise over the brush country of South Texas, a helicopter lifts off with a door gunner strapped in behind a semi-automatic rifle. And within minutes, they are flying low over scrubland, chasing a moving black mass through the mesquite. This is not a military exercise. It is a paid tourist activity. Companies across the state sell seats in that helicopter to ordinary people. No hunting license required on private land with the owner's permission, and the targets are feral hogs, an animal so destructive and so numerous that shooting them from the air has become not just legal, but a small tourism industry in its own right. One outfitter alone has permission to fly over roughly 400,000 acres. Pilots describe the work as a kind of moving hunt rather than a stationary one, since unlike deer, which tend to stay within a few square miles for their entire lives, these animals are constantly on the move, forcing the helicopter to actively chase down sounders across open pasture before the gunner ever gets a clean shot. And even with helicopters, night vision scopes, GPS-tracked decoy pigs, and millions of dollars spent every year, Texas is, by most honest measures, still losing this fight. To understand how a single animal forced an entire state into something that genuinely gets called a war, you have to go back to where these pigs came from in the first place, because they were never supposed to be wild at all. The first pigs arrived in North America with Spanish explorers in the 1500s, brought along simply as a portable food source on long expeditions through unmapped territory, animals that could forage for themselves along the trail and be slaughtered for meat whenever supplies ran low. As colonization spread across what would eventually become the American Southeast and beyond, some of those animals inevitably escaped during river crossings, raids, or simple carelessness, while others were deliberately released to fend for themselves until an expedition needed fresh meat again. For centuries afterward, those descendants lived as a relatively modest, scattered population, spreading slowly across the rural South, more a regional curiosity than a national crisis. The real explosion came later in the early 20th century, when European wild boar were intentionally imported and released into parts of the American South, including notable releases in places like the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee, specifically so wealthy hunters could pursue a more challenging, more exotic quarry than the increasingly domesticated-looking feral pigs already roaming the woods. Those imported boar interbred freely with the existing feral descendants of old Spanish stock, and the offspring of that cross combined the worst possible traits of both: the size, tusks, and aggression of a true wild boar with the fast breeding cycle and adaptability of a domestic pig. What exists across Texas today is essentially that hybrid, running loose across the landscape in numbers nobody fully predicted when those first boar were let off a truck nearly a century ago. And the numbers really are staggering. Texas Wildlife Services currently estimates the statewide population at around 2.6 million feral hogs, which, on its own, accounts for nearly half of the entire United States population of the species. Recent studies cited by that same agency put the annual cost of the damage they cause at roughly $500 million, money lost to torn up cropland, flooded irrigation systems, destroyed fences, ruined pasture land, and in some cases, entire neighborhoods. Some regional analyses focused on specific farming communities have put the annual loss for those areas alone in the hundreds of millions, a sign of just how unevenly concentrated the damage can be, depending on local hog density. Wild pigs have made headlines for tearing up suburban yards and school grounds in the Dallas area, rooting through manicured lawns the same way they tear through a cornfield, leaving the ground behind them looking as if it had been plowed by heavy machinery overnight, sometimes overnight literally, since a single sounder can move through an area in darkness and be gone again before sunrise. Beyond the property damage, feral hogs also carry real disease risk. They are known carriers of brucellosis, a bacterial infection that can pass to humans through contact with an infected animal's blood, body fluid, or tissue, entering through the eyes, nose, mouth, or cut in the skin, and capable of causing severe, long-lasting illness if it goes undiagnosed and untreated. They can also carry pseudorabies and a range of other pathogens that threaten domestic livestock, which is part of why agricultural agencies treat the species not just as a nuisance, but as a standing biosecurity concern, one capable of complicating outbreak response if a more serious foreign animal disease were ever introduced into American pig farming. The reason this single species has been able to overwhelm an entire state's worth of land managers, wildlife agencies, ranchers, and hunters comes down almost entirely to biology. A female feral hog carries her young for only about 115 days, reaches sexual maturity in as little as 6 months, and is fully capable of producing 2 litters in a single year, each one ranging from several piglets to as many as a dozen depending on the sow's age and condition. Under the right conditions, a local population can roughly triple in just 14 to 16 months, a growth curve that would be remarkable in almost any other land mammal of comparable size. They have no natural predators left anywhere in their range capable of meaningfully checking that growth. since the large carnivores that might once have preyed on young hogs, wolves, and large cats were pushed out of most of Texas generations ago. Put simply, removing individual hogs one at a time, no matter how many you remove, is a little like trying to bail out a boat that is filling with water faster than you can scoop it out. Wildlife researchers at Texas parks and wildlife are blunt about this in their own published guidance, stating plainly that no single control method currently available approaches the scale necessary to have a significant long-term effect on wild pig populations across large tracts of land, let alone at a statewide or national level. That has not stopped Texas from throwing nearly every tool available at the problem, and not every method depends on stealth or technology. Some outfitters simply rely on trained tracking dogs to bay and corner a hog so a hunter can dispatch it on foot, a method that works well in thick brush where neither a helicopter nor a thermal scope has a clean line of sight, though it depends heavily on the skill of both the dog and the handler working together in real time. Landowners trap hogs using corral-style enclosures, some now monitored remotely through cellular-connected cameras that send an alert the instant a sounder wanders inside, allowing a trapdoor to be triggered from a phone hundreds of miles away. A setup that can cost real money to install but pays for itself by catching entire family groups at once, rather than one wary animal at a time. Hunters track them at night using thermal and night vision optics, since hogs in heavily pressured areas quickly learn to avoid daylight activity altogether and become almost exclusively nocturnal, a learned behavioral shift that itself shows just how quickly the species adjusts to whatever pressure humans throw at it. And then there is aerial gunning, widely considered the single, most effective way to remove large numbers of hogs quickly across open or lightly wooded terrain, which is exactly why an entire side industry of helicopter hog hunting outfitters has sprung up around it, advertising the experience as both pest control and recreation in the same breath, complete with safety briefings before takeoff and the promise, for many first-time customers, of firing a real gun for the very first time in their lives. One of the more unusual tools in the modern hog hunter's arsenal is a technique wildlife managers call the Judas pig, named only half-jokingly, after the apostle who led authorities to someone who had trusted him. A trapper captures a single hog from a sounder, fits it with a GPS tracking collar, and releases it back into the landscape completely unharmed. Left alone, that hog does the only thing its instincts tell it to do. It goes looking for other hogs because feral swine are deeply social animals that do not survive well in isolation, and an animal that finds itself suddenly alone in unfamiliar territory has every biological incentive to seek out the safety, warmth, and cooperative foraging that a group provides. Once the collar shows it has rejoined a group, trappers or aerial gunners move in and eliminate every animal in that group except the one wearing the collar. The Judas pig survives, finds itself alone again, and sets out once more to find another sounder, leading its rescuers, unknowingly, straight to the next group to be removed. The cycle repeats for as long as the collar keeps transmitting, sometimes for months at a stretch, with researchers in the American South and provincial wildlife crews in Canada both relying on the exact same grim logic. A social animal's drive to never be alone becomes the very thing that dooms every group it manages to find, while the animal doing the betraying, in a strange twist nobody designed on purpose, ends up being the only one of its kind in the whole operation guaranteed to keep on living. Yet even with all of this technology and effort deployed at once, a peer-reviewed study that placed GPS collars on 25 adult feral hogs across 2 South Texas sites found something genuinely surprising. Researchers expected aerial gunning campaigns to dramatically disrupt the surviving hogs' behavior, scattering them, shrinking their territory, changing where and how they moved across the landscape afterward. Instead, the data showed that the home range and core area used by surviving hogs barely changed at all before, during, and after gunning operations, almost as if the survivors simply waited out the danger and then resumed their lives exactly where they had left off. The only measurable difference was that hogs moved at a somewhat faster pace during the actual gunning phase, presumably just trying to get away in the moment, before settling right back into roughly the same patterns of life they had before the helicopter ever showed up. The researchers behind that study, writing for a wildlife management journal, ultimately concluded that aerial gunning had only minor effects on the behavior of the hogs that survived it, a finding they framed as useful, mainly for contingency planning around disease outbreaks rather than as evidence the method could permanently disperse or disrupt an established population. In other words, even a tactic considered the gold standard of rapid population reduction was found to barely dent the underlying behavior of the population that survived it, a quietly unsettling result for anyone hoping that enough firepower alone could solve this problem. If bullets alone could not finish the job, Texas eventually turned to chemistry, and that decision produced one of the strangest and most contentious chapters in the entire saga. In early 2017, Texas Agriculture Commissioner Sid Miller announced approval of a warfarin-based poison bait called Caput de Feral Hog Lure. Dispensed from large bins, specially designed with lids, only a hog's snout was supposed to be able to open, keeping deer, dogs, and other curious animals out, while still allowing pigs to feed on the poisoned grain inside over a period of days. Miller framed the announcement in dramatic terms, declaring in a public statement that wild hogs had caused extensive damage to Texas lands for many, many years, and that with this first approved hog lure, the long-awaited hog apocalypse might finally be on the horizon. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Environmental groups including the Sierra Club, along with hunters, veterinarians, and meat producers, raised the alarm on multiple fronts at once. Warfarin is an anticoagulant, the same basic chemical family used in some rat poisons, and wildlife biologists who had studied its use against hogs in Australia testified that animals poisoned with it could take several days to die, suffering internal bleeding the entire time, a slow and clearly painful death that had already led Australian authorities to ban the same compound for hog control on humane grounds years earlier. Beyond the welfare concerns, critics warned that any predator or scavenger feeding on a poisoned carcass risked secondary poisoning themselves, sending the toxin rippling up the food chain into hawks, vultures, coyotes, and family pets that might stumble across a dead, baited hog in a field. A Texas company called Wild Boar Meat, LLC, whose entire business depended on selling wild hog meat harvested from the landscape, filed suit specifically because contaminated carcasses could poison the human food supply as well, since nothing about the program prevented a hunter from unknowingly harvesting and eating a hog that had ingested the bait but not yet died from it. Within weeks, a state district judge in Austin issued a temporary restraining order halting the entire program before a single bin had even been deployed across most of the state, finding enough merit in the safety concerns to put the brakes on Miller's plan. Facing mounting legal costs and fierce, well-organized opposition, the manufacturer, a company called Symmetrics, ultimately announced it was discontinuing its attempts to register the product in Texas altogether, stating it could not risk the disruption to its business of a prolonged legal battle against opponents with far greater resources. Miller called the company's withdrawal another kick in the teeth for rural Texans, but the outcome was clear either way. Texas's hog apocalypse ended not with a bang, but with a courtroom filing and a quiet corporate retreat less than 2 months after it had been announced to national headlines. Researchers did not give up on the idea of a chemical solution. They simply looked for a safer one. For nearly a decade, scientists at the Kerr Wildlife Management Area northwest of San Antonio quietly tested an alternative compound, sodium nitrite, a common and relatively inexpensive food preservative that proves lethal to hogs in high doses but kills within hours rather than days, a meaningfully more humane outcome than warfarin's slow decline. Researchers had actually begun experimenting with sodium nitrite as a hog control tool all the way back in 2005 in Australia, long before the Caput controversy ever happened in Texas, and by the time American researchers picked up the same approach, there was already a substantial body of prior data to build on. The product, marketed under the name Hoggon, underwent years of careful field testing, including additional trials at a U.S. Army installation near San Antonio, specifically to rule out the kind of secondary poisoning risks that had doomed Caput, since regulators understandably wanted far more certainty this time before allowing any new toxicant near working farmland and public hunting grounds. Final field evaluations wrapped up in 2021, and the resulting data package was sent to the Environmental Protection Agency for review. The agency ultimately declined to approve sodium nitrite for feral hog management anywhere in the United States, leaving researchers back at the drawing board, still searching for a delivery system reliable enough to convince federal regulators it would not end up harming the very wildlife and livestock it was never meant to touch. Other toxicants considered along the way, including compound 1080 and yellow phosphorus, were ruled out even earlier for being either too persistent in the environment or simply impractical at the scale a statewide hog population would require. So, more than half a decade after the failed hog apocalypse, Texas finds itself fighting this war with almost exactly the same toolkit it has always had: traps, dogs, night vision, helicopters, and an extremely patient kind of persistence against an animal that can rebuild its own numbers faster than almost anything else removing it can keep pace with. And if anyone doubts just how far this particular invasive species can adapt when pushed hard enough, they only need to look north across the Canadian border at a population of hogs that genuinely earns the nickname researchers have given them: super pigs. In the 1980s, Canadian agricultural authorities actively encouraged farmers to diversify their operations by raising European wild boar alongside conventional livestock, hoping to tap into a niche market for boar meat that seemed, at the time, like a smart way to hedge against swings in the price of conventional pork and beef. Farmers crossbred those imported boar with domestic pigs to create animals that were larger, hardier, and capable of producing bigger. Litters than either parent line alone, exactly the kind of traits a farmer wants in livestock. For a while, the plan worked exactly as intended. Then, in the early 2000s, the market for boar meat collapsed, demand drying up faster than anyone in the industry had anticipated, and many farmers, suddenly stuck with animals they could no longer profitably sell, simply released them, assuming the harsh Canadian winters would finish the job that the market no longer would. That assumption, according to every researcher who has studied what happened next, turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Those released hybrids did not just survive the prairie winters, they thrived in them. Researchers at the University of Saskatchewan's Canadian Wild Pig Research Project, led by Dr. Ryan Brook, have spent years tracking how far and how fast this population has spread, and the numbers are remarkable. These animals now range across an estimated 620,000 square miles of Canadian prairie, concentrated in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta, with some individuals weighing in excess of 600 pounds, roughly twice the size of a typical feral hog, sampled across many sites in the United States. Researchers attribute much of that extra bulk to a well-documented biological pattern called Bergmann's rule, the tendency for animals of the same species to grow physically larger the further they live from the equator, since a bigger body retains heat more efficiently in extreme cold and loses it more slowly relative to its size. These pigs appear to have adapted to that rule in real time, growing bigger, burlier, and more cold-tolerant than anyone who originally imported them ever anticipated, leading Brook and his colleagues to coin the term super pigs, specifically to capture how far beyond an ordinary feral hog these animals had become. Just as strange as what these animals have learned to do when the snow falls. Researchers studying the population have documented these hogs digging and tunneling directly into snowbanks to construct insulated shelters, structures field biologists have started calling pigloos, which let entire family groups huddle together out of the wind through temperatures that would be lethal to an unsheltered animal of similar size. Camera trap footage has also caught individuals showing pink coloring and irregular dark splotches, physical traits inherited from their domestic pig ancestry that pure European wild boar never display. Visible proof of exactly how thoroughly these wild and farmed bloodlines have mixed together in the decades since their release. Beyond their physical resilience, researchers describe these animals as remarkably intelligent and difficult to track, capable of learning hunting patterns and avoiding pressure in ways that make conventional control methods the same traps, night hunts, and aerial gunning campaigns used so heavily in Texas far less effective against them. Wildlife crews in Saskatchewan have adapted by using helicopters to net gun pigs directly out in the open, fitting them with collars on the spot before releasing them to serve as Judas pigs of their own. The same grim but effective technique developed further south, now repurposed for a landscape of frozen rivers and endless wheat fields rather than mesquite brush. The ecological fallout has been significant. Beyond the obvious crop damage to wheat, barley, and canola fields, researchers have documented these hogs preying directly on ground-nesting waterfowl and their eggs, competing aggressively with native deer and elk for food and habitat, and even altering the behavior of unrelated native species simply by being present on the landscape, changing how raccoons, squirrels, and deer move and forage in areas where hogs have become established, according to ecologists studying the broader pattern across North America. One wildlife ecologist who studies how wild pigs reshape entire ecosystems has noted that these effects extend well beyond simple predation or competition for food, pointing to research showing invasive predators with no natural enemies of their own, especially adaptable generalists like wild pigs willing to eat almost anything, tend to cause more. Native species decline than nearly any other category of invasive animals studied worldwide. Dr. Brook does not soften his language when describing the situation, calling feral swine the most invasive animal on the planet, and more bluntly, an ecological train wreck, a phrase that has been repeated in nearly every major news report on the subject since. Perhaps the most alarming part of this story, though, is where these animals are heading next. Researchers have already documented Canadian super pigs within 10 miles of the United States border, and Dr. Brook himself has said he believes some have likely already crossed from Manitoba into North Dakota over the past 5 or 6 years, slipping through largely unnoticed simply because almost no one was actively looking for them there yet. A study published in the journal Biological Invasions concluded there's a high potential for them to cross into North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Minnesota, 4 states that, until now, have remained largely pig-free thanks to intensive, ongoing control efforts specifically aimed at keeping that border closed, an investment of time and money that has so far paid off, but that researchers warn cannot be relaxed for even a single season, especially since the wider United States population of wild pigs, taken as a whole, has already nearly tripled since the 1980s and spread from 18 states to 35. Unlike a coastline or a mountain range, the line separating Canada from the northern United States runs for thousands of miles with no meaningful physical barrier at all, nothing to stop a population this mobile, this adaptable, and this determined to expand from simply walking across whenever conditions allow. And unlike the Texas hogs further south, these particular animals would be arriving in northern farm country already pre-adapted to exactly the kind of brutal winters that region is famous for. Put the Texas story and the Canadian story side by side, and the genuine aftermath nobody quite expected starts to come into focus. And it is not a hidden conspiracy or a piece of suppressed footage. It is something far more grounded and, in its own way, far more sobering. In Texas, an entire state mobilized helicopters, GPS-tracked decoy, hogs, night vision optics, and eventually even attempted a chemical solution dramatic enough to be nicknamed an apocalypse. And the underlying population has still not meaningfully retreated, with researchers finding that even the most aggressive lethal tactic available barely altered the survivors' basic behavior. In Canada, meanwhile, a deliberate, well-intentioned agricultural decision made decades ago to diversify farm income inadvertently engineered an even tougher, more cold-resistant, more intelligent version of the very same animal, one now expanding toward the same kind of unprepared landscape that Texas has been fighting over for years. Two very different starting points, an accidental hybrid born of old colonial-era livestock practices in one case, and a deliberately bred agricultural product released out of economic necessity in the other, have converged on the same basic lesson. An animal, this fertile, this adaptable, and this socially intelligent, does not simply lose to brute force. And every tool humans invent to control it eventually runs into the same wall of biology that no amount of helicopters, poison, or GPS collars has yet managed to break through. That is the real, well-documented aftermath behind all the dramatic footage of gunners leaning out of helicopter doors and bins of poison bait being quietly shut down by court order. Not a single shocking secret, but a slow, ongoing realization, repeated across two countries in several decades, that humans introduced this animal almost by accident centuries ago, deliberately made it tougher more recently without fully understanding what we were creating, and have been racing to undo both mistakes ever since. One trapped sounder, one collared Judas pig, and one carefully studied helicopter pass at a time against an opponent that keeps adapting just quickly enough to stay one step ahead of whatever comes next. There is a strange kind of humility built into this whole story if you sit with it for a minute. Every single escalation in this fight, from corral traps to thermal scopes to helicopters to poison bins, was designed by people who genuinely believed it would finally tip the balance. And every single time, the species on the other side of that equation simply adjusted, bred faster, moved at night, grew larger, or in the case of the Canadian hybrids, learned to dig itself a shelter in the snow nobody thought it would ever need. None of that means the fight is hopeless. Researchers on both sides of the border continue to report real, local successes in specific watersheds and ranches where sustained, well-funded effort has pushed populations down for years at a stretch. Proof that the war is winnable in pockets, even if it remains unwinnable for, now, at the scale of an entire continent. But it does mean the easy version of this story, the one where a clever new tool finally wins the war in one decisive season, was never realistic to begin with, no matter how many times a new product, a new collar, or a new aerial tactic gets rolled out with confident promises attached. What Texas and Canada have both learned the hard and expensive way is that managing an animal, this resilient looks less like a single dramatic battle and a lot more like a permanent, ongoing relationship, one that every future generation of ranchers, wildlife biologists, and yes, even helicopter tour operators will most likely still be managing long after everyone reading this has moved on to worrying about something else entirely.